So, welcome to another edition of the New World Colloquy series that we are hosting at the Fast Food and Cafe Virtual Expo, which is powered by EatOS. The New World Colloquy series brings to you one on one conversations with stalwarts from the industry. And today we have with us Nason Tyagarajan, CEO of the iconic brand Harry's International Singapore. And interviewing him is Tanu Ganguly, founder of Mishri.com. We're very keen to hear the journey of Harry's, Nason. So, without taking any more time, let me hand you over to Tanu to dive right in.
Thank you, Minnie. Hi, Nathan. How are you?
I'm good, Tanu. Thank you. How are you?
All good, all good. So, like Minnie said, we're all very keen to learn more, hear about your journey. So, let's start from the very beginning, right? You've had over a 25-year-old career. How did it all start? How did you take those first steps into the F&B industry?
Well, it started in Singapore. I'm from here,
Right.
And like most parts of Asia, depending on which country you're at, F&B as a job is not always first in mind for a lot of the young. It's a lot of hard work, and in the service industry, people will want to get an education and move on and be a manager straight away and climb the ladder that way. So unfortunately, I did not put in too much time with my studies. So options became much less out there. However, I needed to work. You needed cash flow when you're young. And so F&B was the only one, or the only industry, shall I say, that was very flexible, and jobs were available. So I had to start all the way from the ground up. So my whole career started in the nightclub industry, Tanu, uh,
Okay.
working as a barback, which means washing glasses and carrying out the trash. So
Okay.
that's how I started at 18.
Wow. So you're being very candid. So let me ask you, before you joined Harry's, which was a while back, um, in this career, you've starting from where you did, you've helmed some very interesting projects across the world, not just in Singapore. So tell us about some of those before we dive into Harry's and the journey there.
Yeah, so I think there was some talent in seen in me when it comes to the F&B side. But I think at the early stages, right, it's more about a person's character and the drive to work hard,
Absolutely.
right? I don't think I was looking to succeed that well, but you just wanted to work hard to make sure the job was there and get that little pay increment wherever you can. Now, in order to do that, a lot of hard work has to go in. So from there, I started climbing the ladder. In Singapore, you got to do national service. So the army came along where I had to serve another 2 years there before I came out again. And yet again, not many options for jobs. So back to the F&B industry again. But I got my manager title quite quickly at a very young age, focusing on the bars and that sector of the F&B industry. And a break came through at the age of, I think I was 24, where I became a bar consultant, and then I found a little niche where you have affluent investors coming together with great ideas because they travel around the world. Unfortunately, they cannot put it to play. They cannot get it going because there will be a lot of disagreements what the cuisine should be, how the design should be. So that's where I found a little gap that, hey, listen, I can be that guy,
Yeah.
to advise or to mediate in that sense.
Right.
So from
And
then on,
also, if I may butt in, the expertise that you had, picked up over the years, that would be something that they were looking for too.
for sure, I think they're always looking for that expertise. But I guess from someone coming from the outside, and investors always have interest in F&B, right? It could be a trophy asset for them. It could be something they like.
Glamorous.
Yes. So when it comes to the nitty gritty, there's a whole checklist that they do not know about. So that's where people like me come in. So I did well there, and then I got some attention from Melbourne, Australia, and then I found a break there, and so I traveled across. Same thing, nightclub journey as well. 6 years in Australia before I went to China,
Yeah.
Shanghai there for a year and a bit, and then came back here.
And so when you did come back here, was Harry's the first place you started back with?
No, actually, I came back. I worked for a public listed company. It was called Life Brands back then. I think the year was 2006. They were the company that brought the iconic British nightclub Ministry of Sound to Singapore back then. And that's where, if the listeners are familiar with, in Singapore, there's this nightlife spot called Clarke Quay. So Ministry of Sound was basically the anchor tenant there. So I joined that group. I was running a brand called Cafe Del Mar, which actually comes from Spain. It's a beach bar. So my job was to build it in Sentosa, right smack on the sand next to the ocean.
Wow.
That was a very, very interesting project. I didn't stay very long with that company, only for a year and a bit. Now, that's because my oldest daughter got born. And I thought, if there's any time I'm going to slow down or retire from the nightclubs, this would be the right time. And so I left and joined a very small company running just one French restaurant. And from there, we did a lot of mergers and acquisitions, new brands. The journey took about 7 years. Sorry, excuse me. Before we sold that business to one of Singapore's largest real estate companies, Far East Organization. I think that was sold to them somewhere in 2014. I stayed on as the chief operating officer for another 2.5 years. And then this time I really thought, okay, it's time for a break. So the whole journey I've been talking about, Tanu, there's no break in between, right? The
Wow.
break would be 2 weeks annual leave if I was lucky. So more family time. I wanted a break. However, Harry's came along, right? I was resting 2 months and a CEO position was open. And I thought, why not? Harry's is a Singapore brand, proudly Singaporean.
Iconic Singapore brand. Yeah.
Yep. 1992 was the first bar. We are 28 years old this year. This year we have 21 stores in Singapore. And I thought I better take this job, because when I was working as a bartender 2-3 doors down the first Harry's in Boat Quay, I could not afford a beer in Harry's. So I said, it's time for me to take this brand. So I jumped straight to the opportunity.
Nice. You mentioned family briefly. Do you think it's tough for F&B? I mean, it is, but how's your experience been to be able to balance family, the long grueling hours that one expects?
Yeah, so I think this is quite similar or common, and this goes throughout the world, right? The work of someone in F&B.
Right.
I've been very lucky. My wife has been very understanding. We met when I was doing nightclubs, right, in Australia. So coming back home 4 or 5 in the morning was the norm. So now going home at 8, 9 p.m., it's great news, right? and with the children, I really try to find time. I mean, at a position where I am, the business does not require me to be on the ground all the time. So unless there's something really urgent on a weekend, I try to work from home and spend more time with the kids. And in order not to lose out too much, I wake up 6 in the morning every day to send them to school. So you get that little 1 hour in the mornings, yes. And then you come back and put them to bed. So that's the routine. So I believe really it's about having a good understanding partner and a family that supports you. It makes things so much easier.
Absolutely. So then you joined Harry as the CEO, Harry's, and how has that been? Harry's, you have 21 outlets, you said, just in Singapore and more across the world. What do you think has made it such an iconic brand? What are the things that are different or USP wise, or what is it that the customer keeps coming back to that's allowed for this kind of a growth?
So basically, I've been on board with Harry's as the CEO for just little over 4 years now. So obviously, there were many leaders before me that have done a great job as well, right, to keep the brand going for 28 years. But the truth of the matter is, Harry's was a standalone bar for more than 10 years, I think, 10 to 15 years before the last owner decided that he needs to expand and he wants to make it bigger. So from there, the work started. I think it's because it was an iconic brand, started in Boat Quay. Now, Boat Quay historically goes back very, very, very far times, right? And a lot of banks are nearby. Everybody's familiar with the brand. And Harry's actually started with jazz. So in 1992, when you start with jazz, it's not a common a sound to find, especially live with live musicians. So I guess it built from there, and then it came into an institution, the older tend to come less, the younger wants to venture in, and then there's a snowball effect. Today, Harry's is a little bit more different. We're more, shall I say, a more real estate business. And when I use the word real estate, I use it because we have to find stores in locations that work. Near the subway station, or MRT as we call it now, near the offices. If we are in the neighborhoods, then at a strip where there's restaurants and bars. So we can't go somewhere far away, put the brand there, and people are going to travel. So in Singapore, a lot of it is convenience. And that's how we manage to plot the stores as we go along. Now, we're very happy that we have a very diverse crowd. We study data a lot. So, age groups, male, female, who drinks more beer, more wine, spirits. So we're spread out in a fair bit that we would cover most sort of consumers out there, even age groups, even nationalities. So that's something that we really, really take very seriously to ensure that each store has its unique customer base, and then build on that.
So would you care to share some of that data? Who's drinking more wine and beer? I'm keen to know.
Well, the ladies are always with the wine. Yep.
Oh, is it? Okay.
So
and does that change over outlets? Is that drastically different from one to the other?
Beer takes most of our sales as far as beverage is concerned. But you'll see a high spike in wine, where we have more ladies in locations like Chimes. There's a location in Holland Village, which is more neighborhood. Spirits comes into play when we're at Clarke Quay or Boat Quay, more the nightlife sort where the younger crowd comes in Orchard Road as well. So this shows us the consumption pattern. It also shows us the age group that comes in. It's easier for us to tie up our deals with our partners and our vendors. But predominantly, yes, we are a beer place, and our main focus or main revenue comes in straight after work. So, I try not to talk about COVID-19, but since we are in the COVID period, a lot of offices are affected, so our revenue is affected. But thankfully, we've built over the years neighborhood bars as well, so those are going well. We have focused a lot on our food. A lot of people think we're just a pub, and it's only alcohol. So 4 years ago, our alcohol versus food would be something like 80%, 20%.
Okay.
Today we are 60-40. So that's a very good number. It shows that the efforts put into the food is there, into the service to run it like a restaurant as well, or a pub restaurant. And that really helps you diversify in terms of revenue streams for the business, instead of just being comfortable with just the alcohol sales.
I was wondering, when you were talking about a lot of customers or guests coming post work, the one thing that we see in India a lot with restaurants is that because of so many apps and so many delivery third-party mechanisms, there's a whole lot of deep discounting that begins. And then after a point, you get into a position where there's a whole lot of competition in that. Every restaurant is offering. How does that work in Singapore? Do you see similar challenges where unless you offer coupons or discounts, your customers might actually venture elsewhere?
Very similar. However, it all depends on the playing field, right? And who you're looking against. Now, in Harry's context, we are very lucky. So think of it this way. I've got high beverage sales. People don't think we're a restaurant. Food doesn't come to mind straight away. But I need to get you through the doors. So giving you that discount is not such a bad thing, because I never had any revenue anyway. So while some businesses are built on discounts, ours is used to attract a certain gap that we never had. So that's a little bit more palatable to us. And when we look at the data, right, even if I'm giving you, Tanu, 50%, it's huge, right?
Yeah.
But then I track how much alcohol you drink, and I make sure you buy that 1-2 glass. And then once I average it out, you walk out of my store only gaining, say, 20 to 30%. Now, that becomes more palatable because my regulars are getting 15. So from there, we learn how do we close the gap, what timings do we give these discounts or not. So there's a little bit of science behind it.
Yeah.
I don't think you can avoid it these days. It's very common.
Mm.
And even you spoke about delivery. So I mean, I'm not working in India full time, right? But with Indian traffic, then delivery would be a good option. However, in Singapore, delivery, the commissions here are very high, right? As high as 30%. So, you do a bricks and mortar restaurant, you end up paying 20% to the landlord of your revenue as rent.
Absolutely.
You're lucky. But to go to 30, but some people say it's utilization of equipment, or it's utilization of staff if you're not busy. But the funny thing is everybody's eating at the same time. So if you're eating in my restaurant at 1 and you want me to serve you at home at 1, it's the same guys who are trying real hard. So the delivery companies get great commission, right? But I guess they deserve it because they work out the logistics and the transport, which restaurateurs would not want to do unless you're as big as a Domino's or Burger King or something, and you feel like you want your own fleet. Even
and you
that,
can invest that much. Yeah.
Even that sometimes it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah. So, you mentioned you have a couple of places running in India also. One problem that a lot of restaurateurs who are starting out typically have is that decision between when you want to expand, do you want to expand more restaurants that you own and run, or do you just franchise? Do you go that model? So, and that's a hot debate. So, which side of the debate do you sit on when it comes to this?
I think I can comment on both sides, right? But I won't make my answer too complicated. So let me share with you just very briefly about our 4 stores in India, right? At one stage we had 10. Now our story was an unfortunate one because India is not working out well for us, and that's our fault because we forced the brand into locations that was ours anyway with different brands. So it was based on convenience to put Harry's in there because based on the menu and the offering, it was very easy to adopt and train, right? But failing to choose a correct site, right? It becomes a little bit more difficult. And India is so huge that, we have 1 in Mumbai, 2 in Bangalore, 1 in Delhi. It was quite hard for us to focus and run that operations, right? And keep a keen eye on it. So we will slowly move out of India only to come back again. And when I say come back again, definitely come back again in a franchise model, right?
Okay.
And I'll tell you why, because there's nothing really much to teach the Indian community because they have so many cool things. Look at the bars and the restaurants that are out there, the cafes, they know what they're doing. So I guess I need a franchisee that perhaps wants a model like how it works in Singapore, right? Straight after work, people come down, weekends, the neighborhood come. Maybe I want for the older crowd or the younger crowd. How do we do it? And cuisine is one thing. The alcohol model is the other thing. Now, why would an established F&B operator then want to pay franchise fees to get it? So there are a lot of reasons, right? A few that I can think of. I don't have to crack my head to go figure out what's the concept, what's the brand, what's the cuisine. How often do I have to develop something? I have to build my own data points in a franchise model. For instance, we have a very successful story in Myanmar. We've got 3 Harrys in Yangon. And Myanmar population 60 million, it's slowly opening up. And our franchisees there, they're wine distributors. They have their own local brands. They've even worked with American brands that didn't become successful. But with the Harry's brand, it's a great success story. And I'm very proud that with their 3 stores in COVID, they're signing for another 3 stores, which is not part of the original deal. So they definitely see an angle. And maybe for Myanmar, it's easier because they market it as a Singaporean brand, So if I say I'm bringing Singaporean brand into Mumbai, how excited would the Mumbai community be? So it's really about that franchisee knowing his crowd, knowing what he wants to get out of them, and doing it right, and then exchanging notes with us, right? So Myanmar works very well with us. I'm learning from them on certain initiatives as well. Their Harry's premium lager beer sells more than mine here, right? And that's because I play down my commercial side. I make my beer here craft. for branding purposes. Where else there, they put it as a commercial beer as the lowest entry point, and then they go by volume. So we have a very great relationship. We share a lot of things. I'm studying their data as well, giving me some insights here. And I follow them on social media, see what they're doing. So with franchisor relationship, it takes both hands to clap. So the franchisee being interested and knowing the market know-how, and obviously being an F&B operator is a great advantage. And the franchisor obviously not just taking his fees and sitting behind, right? I mean, there's an audit process, there's the training process, there's a lot that goes behind it. So as a true F&B operator, it also depends on what business model you're at. So if you came to me, Tanu, and said, Nathan, I want to look at Delhi and I want 3 stores, I'll think very hard. I might take 1 year, right? But if you come to me and say, I want 3 in Delhi, and then from there, I might go to 6, right? And then in 10 years' time, I might sell it to someone else, and I want to profit this way, and that guy, will make it to 8, or he'll move to the next neighboring city. So those kind of discussions,
Well thought out.
it's much better because there are some franchise models out there that are tailor-made for people that have got zero F&B experience, right?
So
However,
are you actively looking right now?
not really. I think my own brands that are there, we have to slowly handle those. Actively looking depends, right? I mean, I am always looking. It could come here or when COVID subsides, right? Maybe 2 years or next year. Then most definitely to answer that question, yes. Because after Myanmar, COVID has delayed us, but we've got some stuff, some meetings lined up in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, Phnom Penh in Cambodia. So Southeast Asia will be closer to Singapore for us. Like I said, India is huge, and India's got a lot of good things. Right. So it's really about finding myself, the right partner to work with, and someone that believes and wants to make the brand work.
And do you think that the geography also matters? So sometimes the geography alone will help you determine, do you want to run your own or do you want to just franchise? So is that something that plays a very important role in that decision?
I think so, because when you look at India and you talk about geography, right, then I will lose out on that conversation, right? Because Singapore is like 5 million population, and I think 40 kilometers left, right, and up, down. So operationally, sometimes it's really difficult. So even for a franchisor, if I came back and did India, I would make sure I have one partner in Mumbai and one partner in Delhi, totally separate. Now, obviously, if there's a big guy out there and there are a lot of big F&B credible and successful companies out there, then for sure he'll get the area development agreement for a few more cities, right? They have their infrastructure set in, they know what they're doing, and they can roll things out very fast. Some franchisees might take my brand and roll out 1 store a year, but there are capable people in India that can roll out 4 stores a year. Yeah. So it really depends on that owner, what he sees with the brand, and where his plan is,
where he wants to take it.
Yeah.
That's true. And we briefly spoke about the pandemic earlier. A lot of QSRs, of course, F&B is one of the industries which has taken, which has been hit, pretty badly in that sense, though things are getting better across the world. How do you see QSRs and cafes emerge out of this? Are there ways they can minimize the hit? I'm sure a lot of people watching who are restaurateurs or planning in their planning stage right now are either thinking that they're going to push their decisions now or thinking of how to emerge. What would you tell them?
Yeah, so
tough one.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? So I'll give some of my thoughts, but it might not apply to India specifically, right? It's a market that I'm not very well versed in. So even if I'm looking at what's going on in the situation here, with safe distancing measures coming in, and this word that F&B operators don't like to hear, which is the new normal, right? How many seats have I lost because of in-store dining and the precautions or the law that has come in Singapore's context? Some of my stores, I lose 30% seats. Some go as high as 50. With the seat restrictions, I would have to look at my turn. I think I would be looking at, can my delivery compensate a little bit? how do I fight in the delivery space? Can I grow the APC, the per head spend, or per check spend? If they used to, spend 100 rupees, can I get 110, 120? So that helps a little bit. Next thing is, which is a very difficult one. What about the quiet times? What do I do after lunch between 2 to say before dinner starts, right? I've got real estate. Besides delivery, nobody wants to eat at the time. And in QSR model as well, sometimes it's difficult. They know their hours and their timing. So I guess if you look at every revenue stream and try to make something come out slightly better, either by volume increment or per head spend increment, that would be good. Now, if someone can find a brand new revenue stream, now that's a whole different story, right? So there is collaboration that you can think of. So I'll give you an interesting story. When COVID first hit Singapore, there were a lot of restrictions, right? And bubble tea is very famous in Singapore. And the authorities realized that they could not control the crowds in some malls. So bubble tea was shut for a good 2 to 3 weeks. Or was it a month maybe? So these bubble tea guys had no avenue. They could not go back to their stores. So what they did, they took their machines and went to the next restaurant and said, hey, listen, sell my bubble tea through your restaurant. Delivery, let's piggyback, because just to get one bubble tea delivered is difficult. But if you can get a salad, sandwich, and a bubble tea. So they went through that method in order just to survive. But now that they are open, they still continue that collaboration. So perhaps some QSR brands or SKUs can tie up long term with other brands, just especially delivery space as well, to make it a little bit more convenient or attractive for consumers to look at who shall I buy from today. That could be one possibility, or even some new revenue stream in store as well.
That's very interesting. In fact, what a lot of countries also saw is some kind of a help or package, from the government side. It hasn't happened in India. The F&B guys were really hoping that something would come up, at least a help to pay off the salaries, to help with some amount of salaries. Has some of that happened in Singapore?
Yeah, I think to share honestly, the government here has done an excellent job. Right? Some might argue they could have done faster or slower, but to me, overall, and looking at the global situation, without that help, we'll be nowhere today. In terms of salaries, they don't help all the workforce, but definitely Singaporean workforce. So in F&B context here, for some of our listeners, we depend on foreign workers as well, foreign work pass holders to work, because it's not every Singaporean wants to work in F&B. But minimal, we have 60 to 70% Singaporeans, and then the 30 to 40% is made up of foreign talent, Philippines, India, China, Taiwan. So helping the Singaporeans, we had a 2.5 month lockdown. They helped us up to 75% of wages, right?
Wow.
And after the lockdown, they're helping us 50%. Right, and that 50% stretched for about 6 months. Now they announced they're going to help us another 7 months for 30%. Now, without all these, we had to cut our staff salary quite substantially, and it's not easy, right? Everyone's got bills to pay, and so without this, it would have been so difficult for a lot of lives, right? So the livelihood part came in on this rescue package. Now, another one that was very difficult was the landlords, right? So there was a lot of talk on the landlords. So the government stepped in quite well. I think they collect property tax income of about, say, 1.2 months of an average rent from the landlords. Yep. So they've waived that, add 0.8 in cash to the landlords and say, now you give your tenants 2 months. Wow. Then they made it law for the landlord to match the government by giving another 2 months. Now, we're not going to get anything more than that, but basically we got 4 months straight. And the theory was the government gives 2, the landlord gives 2, and we were in lockdown for 2. So everyone's even, and they passed it in Parliament as law for this COVID situation. And of course, there are other cash flow issues that's helped with bank loans and lower percentages. So yeah, without all this help, there's no way. And Singapore is a SME country, small, medium enterprise company. So a lot of our jobs are from these small companies that annual turnover of 100 million and below. And I think we are about providing 65-70% of the workforce or the jobs out here. So it is good that this relief came in a timely manner.
Yeah, yeah. That's actually very good and very well planned, well thought out, actually. Yeah. So restaurants over here are hoping to get back on their feet sooner rather than later, of course. But let's see how that turns out. Um, I'm going to ask you a couple of more questions, and then I think it'll be time to wrap it, Nathan.
Sure,
So
sure.
tell me, um, I love the food in Singapore, and I want to ask you, where are the places that you go to eat, and what are your favorite hangouts? Of course, Harry's, beyond Harry's. What are the places that you can be found at on a Friday evening?
Oh, that's a tough one, right? Because I've been trained to say Harry's.
But we know it's Harry's. Now beyond that.
So beyond that, I think for my nightclub days, I then went into restaurants, and then now Harry's, which is F&B pub sort, right?
Right.
So actually, I would go to finer restaurants only if there was a meeting, or only if there was a reason to see something, right? Someone won a Michelin star, so I have to go once and that's it. But actually, I'm more a local neighborhood person. So in Singapore, we call it coffee shops or hawker centers.
Hawker
So,
centers.
yes.
You have a
So-
Michelin at a hawker center also. So
Yeah. So local food, 750 ml bottles of Tiger beer, local, and that's how I unwind. I've been lucky because on weekends, I've got a bit of space at home, and then friends and family, they visit. So really no real hangout, because I do not go out there to drink or socialize. It's either at my house or in somewhere very relaxed and very normal, like a hawker center or a coffee shop. And local food, local hawker food is what I usually go for, compared to your Western cuisine or your pastas and burgers. So that's how I normally wine and dine.
relax and chill. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, my last question, and it sort of, I think, sort of sums up the whole thing. You started in the beginning by saying all those years you put in, all that hard work, to get that little increment in the salary and all of that. In your industry, hiring people is a challenge. Also, to retain them is a challenge. So when someone is looking to hire good talent for their pub or bar or QSR, what beyond that skill for that specific role, of course, what are the things that you look at, and what can you tell people that if you get a guy with this quality, don't let him or her go?
Yeah, so I think when you look at skill or qualification or experience specific to F&B, right, I'll be looking for that in terms of a senior manager. Anything else, I'm trying to find the character of the person. Now, it's always touch and go, right? How much can you get from a 30 minutes interview? And where I am in management now, I don't get to interview my rank and file coming in, but you can pick up certain things. So I guess the willpower to work, the discipline and the honesty of a person, they can do anything, those traits would stick with them. So I'm on the hunt to look for those traits in a person and try to retain them, because learning, once they have those traits, they will learn. It's not hard. And in these days, I mean, I've got 200 employees, which is not a lot, but also not very little. So
Absolutely.
to make sure that you got the right managers to nurture the young and to get them to that level is another headache, right? So some of your managers might not have the traits that the ones below have. So between HR and the leaders within my team, we try our best to make sure we can identify these people, get them the right training, give them the right push, so that we can keep them within the organization, because it's quite common in F&B for someone to move over for extra 100 rupee salary or $50 or something in Singapore context, right? Because they need that cash. So how do you then paint them this picture that hard work would bring you somewhere? Do they know how many years they need or how long they take? So I'm very, very supportive of my guys when they want to leave, because there's a step somewhere else which I don't have, right? So constantly letting them know and working these things out is very important. And I do a lot of work with my HR manager. There are a lot of things that cannot be done through an email or through Zoom or through a memo, right? So getting that staff and letting them know that journey and that stepping stone is great. And then without that, their mind is always looking out, looking out, looking out. So
Mm.
like every worker or employee out there, even myself, right? You would want to know at least, okay, let's just plan 5 years. You know, if someone goes to takes up a job in your company and he doesn't know what's happening in the next 5 years, then we as leaders have or
Failed.
business, we've not done well, right? So they must at least know that. And in rank and file, if you are lower down the ranks, then at least 2 years, 2-3
Yeah.
years. You know, once they know, you can work with them on it. And I think that part's
Yeah.
very important for managers and HR personnel to ensure.
Fabulous, fabulous. It was lovely talking to you, Nathan. Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone who tuned in or is listening will have benefited a great deal from your experience and all the thoughts you shared. Thank you.
I hope so. I hope so.
I'm
Thank you,
certain.
Tan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. Stay safe. Bye.